Coming up, the Duc d'Enghien says no, Prime Minister Maurepas says no, and Lafayette says, why not? Welcome to Living Lafayette. For the Lafayette Alliance here in LaGrange, Georgia, I'm Richard Ingram. The pipeline was stoked. The Duc de Broglie would recruit junior French officers and would host them at banquets and dinners, at which he would extol the virtues of going to America and fighting alongside Americans for their independence against England. Then he would send those French officers to Silas Deane, who would commission them in the American Continental Army, and they'd go to America. Silas Deane really had no authority to do that. The Continental Congress had not okayed it. But Deane thought that the Continental Army needed experience, it needed prestige, and so on his own authority, he started commissioning these French officers into the Continental Army. So the scheme was, de Broglie would recruit the officers, send them to Silas Deane. Deane would commission them. They would then board ship, go to America. They would fight in the Continental Army, and then it would come to the attention of the Continental Congress that these officers were experienced and they had prestige, and that would foment a call on the part of the Continental Congress for a replacement for George Washington. Silas Deane was no fan of Washington, and lo and behold, the Duc de Broglie would be available. So that's how the Duc de Broglie and Silas Deane saw this scheme playing out. The first officer to be commissioned was Baron de Kalb. He had experience. He was 55 years old. Sign-on bonus of 12,000 livres. He was a lieutenant colonel in the French army, but he was commissioned a major general in the Continental Army. And in the same contract with Baron de Kalb was Lieutenant Dubois-Martin. He was commissioned a major, and he would be aide-de-camp to Baron de Kalb. No sign-on bonus. That was on November the 7th, 1776. On November the 20th, the Vicomte de Noailles commissioned a major general, such that by December the 1st, Silas Deane had 16 French officers on his roster headed for America. The Vicomte de Noailles, the Comte de Ségur, and Lafayette, the Three Musketeers First Edition, they all agreed. They wanted to get commissions. They wanted to go to America. There were two impediments. First, they wanted the endorsement, the permission really, of Prime Minister Maurepas. But that posed some practical problems for Maurepas. These three were not low-level officers. They were visible. And if they were commissioned, if they were given permission, people would take attention to that. Lord Stormont, who was the English ambassador to France, was vigilant. And he could call a breach of France's neutrality on that account. So it posed some practical problems for Maurepas. Second, and maybe more important, all three of them were underage, which in France at the time, under the age majority, was 25. So they would have to get permission from parents or guardians. The Comte de Ségur was the first to drop out. His family objected, and he didn't think that the ministry was going to give permission in the first place. The Vicomte de Noailles ran interference for himself and for Lafayette. He wrote a letter to the ministry asking permission, got no reply. And then he started to lobby the Duc d'Enghien, his father-in-law, Lafayette's father-in-law, to use the Duc d'Engien's power and position to convince Prime Minister Maurepas to give them permission to go to America. One time, when Noailles was lobbying the Duc d'Enghien, Lafayette was there, and Lafayette popped up to say that he, too, was excited about going to America and fighting with Americans. And the Duc d'Enghien turned on him, just wheeled and let him have it. I am not writing any letter on your account. Lafayette was humiliated. I mean, on the one hand, being yelled at by his father-in-law. On the second hand, his best friend, the Vicomte de Noailles, right there. Lafayette went to his mentor, the Duc de Broglie, to tell de Broglie the circumstances and that his father-in-law, the Duc d'Enghien, was stalling Lafayette's plans to try to get commission to go to America. Initially, de Broglie did not encourage Lafayette. He knew that Lafayette's uncle had died in the War of Austrian Succession. He knew that Lafayette's father had died at the Battle of Menden. And de Broglie didn't want to be accused of putting Lafayette in harm's way. But there again, de Broglie had a lot riding on this scheme. And Lafayette could bring attention to the whole process and to experience and prestige, and Lafayette also had the connections at court. It could further de Broglie's ambitions. So de Broglie overcame his reservations and sent Lafayette to see Baron de Kalb. Both Vicomte de Noailles and Lafayette went to see de Kalb. Noailles was a little hesitant. He was not going to buck the Duc d'Enghien, and he certainly wasn't going to run counter to Prime Minister Maurepas if he were not given permission. Finally, the Duc d'Enghien agreed to write a letter trying to persuade Prime Minister Maurepas to give Noailles permission to go to America. It put Prime Minister Maurepas in an awkward position. He really had no trouble with French officers going to America. And if his hand were called on it, well, he would just feign ignorance or offended sensibilities. But these were high echelon nobles, and a lot of attention would be brought to them, and the Duc d'Enghien had now made a formal request to Prime Minister Maurepas to reply in writing as to whether or not Vicomte de Noailles would be given permission. Maurepas knew that the letter would leak. He knew that whatever he wrote would come to the attention of Lord Stormont, and Lord Stormont was vigilant. So Maurepas replied in writing, no, denied permission. Noailles cannot go to America. So Noailles was done. Noailles was not going to buck the Duc d'Enghien. Noailles was not going to run counter to Prime Minister Maurepas' denial of permission. Lafayette, on the other hand, was undaunted. He met with Baron de Kalb just about every day, sometimes would meet with him at the Hôtel de Noailles. Adrian was there. Baron de Kalb was under the impression that the Duc d'Enghien would be agreeable if Lafayette got a rank of sufficient magnitude. De Kalb thought that Adrian knew all the details of the scheme. Well, the fact was, the Duc d'Enghien was not on board, would not be on board. The fact was that Adrian did not know the details of what was going on. On December the 7th, 1776, Baron de Kalb took Lafayette to see Silas Deane. Deane was hesitant about giving a commission to a 19-year-old. He was a captain in the Noailles Dragoons, but he had never been in combat. He had never been shot at. But there were some things in Lafayette's favor. How much sign-on bonus do you want? None. How much pay? None. To Silas Deane, this was looking better and better. What rank do you want? Major General. Full stop there. There was only one rank higher than Major General, and that was General of the Army. And there was only one of those, and that was George Washington. But there again, Silas Deane thought, as did Duke de Broye, here is a young man who has connections at court, and those connections might persuade the court to be more supportive of the American Revolutionary War effort. Here is someone who was highly visible and could bring attention to the American Revolutionary War effort. And here is someone who was, without doubt, enthusiastic and excited about this whole idea of liberty and about independence. Done. Deane signed him. So Silas Deane dictated the contract. Baron de Kalb transcribed it. Lafayette signed it. You remember, Deane could not speak much French. Lafayette could not speak English, so de Kalb was the intermediary. December the 7th, 1776, Lafayette became a major general in the Continental Army. Lafayette did not know that the day before, Silas Deane had written the Continental Congress, their Committee on Secret Correspondence, to suggest that George Washington be replaced as Commander-in-Chief by the Duke de Broye. That same day, Lafayette became aware that his best friend, the Vicomte de Noailles, had gotten a letter from Prime Minister Maurepas declining permission to go to America. Noailles was out. There were two contingents of French officers that were now prepared to go to Le Havre the next day and board ship and go to America. One under the supervision of Baron de Kalb and the other under General Ducoudray. Lafayette was supposed to go with de Kalb the next day, but Lafayette was conflicted. He wanted things resolved with his father-in-law, despite the fact that his father-in-law, the Duc d'Anne, was so harsh with him. Lafayette respected his father-in-law and wanted his father-in-law on board. So Lafayette went to visit his mentor once again, the Duc de Broye. Well, de Broye was not at office. He was at his country estate in Suffolk. So Lafayette unburdened himself to Secretary Dubois-Mortain. Well, Dubois-Mortain really couldn't give him an answer and sent him back to Baron de Kalb. Well, Baron de Kalb was a military man. He listened, but then sent him back to Dubois-Mortain. Lafayette spent 3 hours with Dubois-Mortain that day, trying to reconcile this discrepancy in his mind. And finally, Lafayette sat down and wrote a letter to the Duc de Broye, explaining what the problem was, what the issues were, and asked de Broye his opinion. And then he asked Secretary Dubois-Mortain to get it delivered to de Broye. Lafayette never heard back from that letter. Take just an undistracted moment to think about Lafayette and the importance he placed on getting the Duc d'Anne's permission. It was a matter of honor. It was not just an adolescent, a teenage angst. He wanted the Duc d'Anne on board. It was a matter of honor to him. And now he was spending time thinking it through. Meanwhile, this contingent of officers, the ones up at Le Havre and the ones making the rounds in the cafes at Paris, they'd been boasting and chest-thumping about how they were going to go to America and whip up on redcoats. Very indiscreet. Lord Stormont had his ear to the ground. He caught wind of it all. Lord Stormont pointed out to Prime Minister Maurepas that all this boasting and this commissioning and going to America was intolerable, that the consequences would be dire, and that it was a breach of neutrality, period. Prime Minister Maurepas, now he was obligated to reinvigorate that facade of neutrality. So Maurepas notified the authorities at the port of Le Havre, shut it down. No officer can board ship and go to America, period. And Maurepas notified the chief of police of Paris, Lieutenant General Lenoir, that any officer who claimed that the French government was encouraging officers to go to America to fight against England should be severely and very publicly arrested. So the great scheme was on hold. No officer could board ship at Le Havre to go to America. Silas Deane could not provide transport because Lord Stonewall was watching him. And besides that, Benjamin Franklin was en route to join Deane at Paris, which means there would be even more scrutiny. And furthermore, Franklin was an outlier. Deane didn't know where Franklin would stand on this scheme. Matter of fact, it bothered Secretary Dubois-Martin so much that Dubois-Martin wrote Baron de Kalb to ask de Kalb to write Deane, asking Deane to discuss it with Benjamin Franklin, because Franklin was of such stature that if he agreed to this scheme, things would happen. If Benjamin Franklin ever knew about this, he never let on. He kept his hand close to his vest. Lieutenant Dubois-Martin was at his apartment in the Hotel de Enghien, and he was grousing. His brother, older brother, Secretary Dubois-Martin, who worked with the Duc de Broglie, was there listening. The lieutenant didn't understand. He said, "We have a problem. Let's find an answer." He spent 11 years in the Navy. When they needed something, they just scrounged. They needed a ship, they found it. Besides, Lieutenant Dubois-Martin said, "Why can't somebody with money, somebody like Lafayette, why can't they just buy a boat and we board it and go to America?" It was one of those drive-by, passing fancy ideas. But his older brother, the secretary, was listening. And his brother said, "Hold that thought. You stay right there. You write out that idea, flesh it out. I'll be right back." The secretary went out and collared Lafayette, brought Lafayette back, and then told his younger brother, said, "Go ahead, tell him what you told me." "I'm a lieutenant," he said, "a lowly lieutenant. Nobody pays any attention to me. I'll go to Bordeaux. Less prying eyes there than at Le Havre. And at Bordeaux, there's one of the largest ship owners in all France, Recul de Basmarin et Rambaud at Bordeaux. The chief executive officer is Pierre Basmarin. He supports the insurgency. He knows the risks. He's worked with them before, and he knows there's a profit in it. I'll find a boat. You front the cash. We'll go to America. What do you say?" Lafayette was delighted. "Why not?" he said. Matter of fact, Lafayette changed his motto to "Cour non," or "Why not?" It would be on his coat of arms. Louis Gottschalk says that motto helped to boost Lafayette when his spirits were flagging, and that it was also a ready reply to any critics. Why not? Cour non. He had a motto before that. It was "Vis sat contra fatum." Vigor suffices against fate. Not quite as catchy. So, Lieutenant Dubois-Martin went that night to Bordeaux. Lafayette was ecstatic. They now had a plan. The Duc d'Enghien thought that there was a rumble afoot, but he couldn't put his finger on it. He didn't have any details. So he decided to leverage Prime Minister Maurepas once again to put official hindrance to whatever Lafayette was doing. So the Duc d'Enghien asked Prime Minister Maurepas to investigate Lafayette to find out. Well, again, Maurepas really didn't have any problem with these plans, but the Duc d'Enghien was powerful. He was up high on the hierarchy of nobility. He was obligated to help Duc d'Enghien out. So Maurepas sent Prince de Montbray, who was in the Ministry of War, to interrogate Lafayette. Lafayette admitted what he'd hoped to do and implied that he might rethink it, but really hedged on giving it up. Montbray went back and reported to Prime Minister Maurepas, yeah, here's what he plans on doing. And for his part, Montbray's part, he didn't think Lafayette was going to give it up. And he told Maurepas that. Maurepas reported the conversation to the Duc d'Enghien, but so much as to say there's nothing concrete. It's all idea. It's all pie in the sky. And Maurepas dropped it. He had done his duty by the Duc d'Enghien, and he dropped it. But Lafayette, as a consequence of this, now knew that he was under scrutiny, and he had to be discreet. He no longer went to see Silas Deane at his headquarters at the Hotel de Hamburg on Rue de Jacob, but he would meet with Deane's secretary, William Carmichael. William Carmichael is not well known. He was a Marylander. Tench Tillman, who was a fellow Marylander and aide-de-camp to George Washington, was his friend. Lafayette and William Carmichael would meet at unseemly hours. Sometimes they'd ride around Paris streets in Lafayette's carriage, talking liberty. William Carmichael helped to establish Lafayette's vocabulary on liberty. William Carmichael was a seminal influence in Lafayette's life and his thinking. Furthermore, Lafayette's retinue thought they needed a diversion. Prime Minister Maurepas or the Duc d'Enghien could scuttle this whole enterprise. Lafayette's cousin, the Prince de Poix, had long invited Lafayette to take a trip to London to see Adrienne's uncle, who was the ambassador at the court of St. James, the Marquis de Lafayette. Lafayette really hadn't wanted to go before, but he decided now was the opportunity to do it. So he and the Prince de Poix planned on a trip to London. Surely no one would ever guess that Lafayette was planning on going to America to fight against England if he went into the Lion's Den at London. On February the 11th, 1777, Lafayette got word from Lieutenant Dumartin at Bordeaux. He found a boat. It was La Bonne Mere. It was a merchant vessel. It had been to America before. 220 tons, 2 cannon, a crew of 30. The commander was a Captain Laboissière. 112,000 livres, 40,000 down, the rest in June, and the ship would be ready in mid-March. Lafayette was delighted. One change, the name, La Bonne Mere. La Victoire. Lafayette changed it to the Victory. On February 16th, 1777, Lafayette and Prince de Poix boarded ship on the English Channel headed for London. Baron de Kalb would get word to him when the ship was ready and when he needed to come back. The race was on. This has been Living Lafayette. To discover, to inform, to entertain. Until next time.